What if a single mistake, just one wrong click, could change not only your career, but the fate of an entire town? Grace Whitman, a weary executive secretary in Columbus, Ohio, never meant for anyone important to read her midnight email. It was raw, honest, and filled with the frustrations of a daughter who grew up in a factory town now facing closure. That message, sent too fast, landed in the inbox of Daniel Hart, the cold and untouchable CEO of a 98-year-old company. From that moment, everything unraveled and then began again. A dying steel plant, a community holding its breath, a man and a woman forced to face both rumor and truth. Could one email of criticism turn into a blueprint that saves hundreds of jobs? Could trust grow where there had only been silence? And could love emerge from the ashes of scandal, steady enough to last a lifetime? This is a story about mistakes that become miracles, about courage whispered at the right moment, and about the power of honesty to reshape lives. If you believe in second chances, stay with us. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because this is only the beginning. The rain had been falling for hours in Columbus, soaking the sidewalks, drumming steadily against old brick walls, and rattling the window panes of Grace Whitman's small apartment. She lived above a bakery, the kind of place that opened before dawn and filled the neighborhood with the smell of yeast and sugar. Tonight, though, the ovens were silent, and the only fragrance drifting up through the floorboards was the faint ghost of flour. Grace sat hunched over her laptop, her body sagging with fatigue. At 35, she had grown accustomed to long hours, but this day had been brutal even by her standards. She had chased down missing reports, fielded calls that never seemed to end, and rewritten the same memo half a dozen times to satisfy a manager who cared more about style than substance. She was an executive secretary, yet sometimes she felt like a machine built to stamp, staple, and smile. On the desk beside her, a chipped mug sat half full of black coffee. Grace never bought the fancy kind, only the cheapest drip from the corner shop. It was bitter and a little burned, but she liked that about it. The sharp taste reminded her of mornings when her mother used to drink coffee before teaching at the high school back in Lorraine. Life wasn't always sweet, her mother said. So better to start the day knowing the flavor of honesty. Scout, her golden retriever, thumped his tail on the rug. He had sensed her restlessness all evening, tilting his head every time she sighed. Now he rose, padded toward her, and bumped his nose against the desk leg. Grace reached down to scratch his ears, but her fingers trembled. On the glowing screen, an email sat half-finished. She had opened it to her sister, the one person who always listened without judgment. The words spilled like a confession. She wrote about the endless bureaucracy, about files that took weeks to move from one desk to another. She wrote about the silence that fell whenever Daniel Hart, the CEO, entered a room. His presence was like steel cold, unbending, sharp enough to cut the air. She typed faster, almost feverishly, as if each keystroke might free her from the day's weight. If Hart thinks this is leadership, she wrote, then he's blind. The company survives on contracts and reputation, not on the well-being of its people. If I were him, I would actually listen instead of building walls of procedure. For a moment, her hands stilled. She stared at the words, the rawness of them. Her heart pounded. This was supposed to be private, a late-night vent shared with family. Tomorrow, she and her sister would laugh about it over the phone. She hovered the mouse over the send button. Scout, sensing her distraction, nudged closer. His tail swept across the desk. The mug tipped. Dark coffee spilled in a sudden arc across the keyboard. Oh no, Scout. Grace lunged forward with a wad of napkins. The screen flickered. Keys clattered under her frantic fingers. Then, with a soft ping, the message disappeared. She froze. Breath locked in her chest. Her eyes flew to the corner of the screen where the sent folder opened automatically. And there it was. Not to her sister, not even close. The system's auto-suggest, treacherous in its efficiency, had filled in a different name. The address glared back at her. Daniel, Harto Hartweaver. Calm. For several seconds, she couldn't move. The rain outside pounded harder, as if mocking her. Scout whined, confused by her sudden stillness. No, 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 she whispered. Her hands shook as she clicked frantically. There had to be a way to recall it. She tried the command, but the screen returned a blunt refusal. This action is not available. Her stomach lurched. Every line she had written, the complaints, the metaphors, even the phrase cold as steel was now resting in Daniel Hart's inbox. The very man whose expression rarely softened, whose clipped words could silence a room. Images flooded her mind. Hart reading her message, eyebrows narrowing, Hart calling HR in the morning, Hart watching her walk out with a box of belongings. Scout barked once, sharp and worried. Grace pressed both hands to her face. "I've ruined everything," she murmured. Her voice cracked. The job had never been her dream, but it was stability. It paid the rent, covered her mother's medical bills back in Lorraine, bought the kibble Scout devoured each week, and now all of it hung by a thread. She lowered her hands, staring at the screen as if it might undo itself. That was when a small, merciless notification appeared at the bottom corner. Read. The word sliced through her like a knife. Not only had Daniel Hart received it, he had already opened it. There was no time to hope he might overlook it, no chance it could be buried under other messages. Grace leaned back, her chair creaking in the quiet. Outside, headlights smeared across wet pavement. The bakery sign below buzzed faintly, a weak hum against the steady rain. She felt smaller than ever, as though the night itself pressed against her window, swallowing what little courage she had left. Scout climbed onto the couch and rested his head on his paws, eyes fixed on her. His steady breathing was the only comfort in the room. Grace shut the laptop, but the glow lingered in her mind, harsh and unrelenting. She wrapped her arms around herself. The words she had typed in a moment of exhaustion now felt like chains. Tomorrow would bring consequences, and she had no shield. She sat motionless, listening to the rain hammer the old frame of the window, until the sound became a rhythm she could no longer separate from the racing of her own heart. An email could shake a 98-year-old company. It sounded impossible until you remembered what that company made. Every hammer, every wrench, every small chrome screw had paid for roof repairs, choir robes, prom dresses, and prescription refills in a Midwestern town. Metal, yes, but also mortgages and birthdays. Hart and Weaver, Forge began in a brick shed behind a grocer's lot on the south side of Columbus. The founders shaped tool steel on winter mornings, breath like smoke in the light. Orders arrived by postcard and phone. Hardware stores kept catalogs under the counter, pages dog-eared by men who measured their days in inches and grit. The company grew through wars and recessions. Lines of drivers once idled outside to load crates bound for farm co-ops and union shops. There was pride in weight and balance. A Hart and Weaver hammer sat heavy in the hand, like a promise you could trust. Time thinned the margins. Big box chains came with global contracts and razor prices. Imports arrived by container, shiny and cheap. The old customers still loved the brand, but loyalty had to live beside rent and payroll. The math grew mean. Lorraine carried the history like a scar and a blessing. The plant stood near the lake, its windows filmed with grit, its roof patched and repatched. The whistle still cried at shift change. On third shift. Light spilled through open doors and caught in the fog. Inside, the air tasted of oil and hot metal. Calloused hands fed stock into presses. Sparks bloomed and vanished. Sundays belonged to the church basements and the Union Hall. Potlucks showed up in foil and plastic tubs. Names were taped to slow cookers. People swapped shifts and recipes. The high school band practiced down the block, brass echoing under the bleachers. Friday nights, the football field glowed. Dads in work boots stood along the fence, thermoses in hand. Grace Whitman had been one of the kids playing tag under those bleachers. Her father had spent 3 decades in Lorraine, a machinist with a steady stance and a low voice. He brought home a lunchbox that smelled faintly of coffee and steel wool. He kept his tools clean and his promises cleaner. The toolbox sat now on Grace's bookcase in Columbus. It was dented at the corners rubbed bright from years of use. The lid creaked when she opened it. Inside lay a tape measure, a square, and a small punch stamped with her father's initials. Every so often she took them out, lined them up, and breathed in the old smell of oil and pine dust. It steadied her. She had left Lorraine when the plant first flirted with layoffs. A posting in Columbus offered stability. Just for a while, she told her mother. A while stretched into years. She learned the office rhythms, the quick turns, the invisible work of making other people's calendars look effortless. Her days began before dawn over the bakery. Flour hung in the air like quiet snow. She bought black coffee at the corner store, $1 and change. The cashier kept a jar for pennies. Grace sent money home when the electric bill swelled, or her mother's insurance puzzled them both. She kept receipts in a neat stack held by a clothespin. On Fridays, she called her mother while walking the 2 blocks to the bus stop. They talked about the weather and the pastor's new sermon series and which neighbor's dog had taken to digging under the fence. They did not talk about fear unless it leaked through by accident. Daniel Hart had grown up in this story of steel, too, though from a different vantage. His father's photograph hung outside the Columbus boardroom, smiling in a suit that didn't quite fit his broad shoulders. Daniel had smiled like that as a boy beside a stamping press. Ear protection crooked on his small head. "Someday, you'll run it," the older men told him. He did. At 44, Daniel wore the role like a plate welded to his chest. He excelled at numbers and tempo. Meetings ran to the minute. He marked off projects with colored tabs. He believed in efficiency with a convert's zeal. People mistook that for coldness. Grace had, too. Maybe they weren't wrong. The higher floors were quiet places. Quiet sometimes passed for frost. The board had grown restless over 2 hard years. A line of red cells marched across the operating spreadsheet for Lorraine. Maintenance deferred, energy costs up. A furnace that wanted replacing, not patching again. A retailer delayed payment and demanded concessions. Consultants circled like gulls in a parking lot. Professional smiles hiding the scent of opportunity. Options, the board chair had said in that careful tone older men use when they think they are being kind. Segments with persistent underperformance. Strategic redeployment, temporary closure. Phrases that could live on a slide deck and not draw blood until later. Word leaked the way it always did, through a cousin's cousin who cleaned the conference room after a planning session. Contingency turned into closing by lunchtime. The church ladies added names to prayer lists. The union rep called a meeting. The diner served coffee into the afternoon, while men counted years in their heads and thought about braces and rent. Grace heard it from her mother first, not in a tidy sentence. In a pause between talk of the pastor's wife and a recipe for lemon bars. A breath that stuttered and then found a path. "People are talking," her mother said finally, "about the plant." Grace stopped walking. The bus roared past and flung a mist of gray water over her shoes. She said she would call later and tried to keep her voice even. The toolbox felt heavier on the shelf that night. Every piece of steel inside it seemed to know the weight of what could be lost. At Hart and Weaver headquarters, the lobby smelled faintly of citrus and copier ink. A glass case held a row of legacy tools on velvet. Their handles gleamed in the light. A brass plaque promised quality since 1927. Upstairs, emails stacked like cordwood. The company kept moving, because that was what companies did. Still, something fragile had begun to tremble. Grace watched from her corner of the floor, where the big windows ignored the weather and offered the same city roofs no matter the season. She saw Daniel stride past with his quiet entourage, posture straight as a yardstick. He could carry 5 conversations in his head and still notice a crooked frame. She thought of the email that had left her laptop last night like a bird flushed from cover. She thought of the word read. Lorraine tried to act like nothing was wrong. Trucks rolled in and out. The cafeteria served its Thursday special, meatloaf with brown gravy. Men traded jokes in line, eyes sliding to the side. In the locker room, the bulletin board carried a fresh sheet union meeting. Friday, 7. That afternoon, an administrative assistant printed colored dashboards for a finance review. Percentages, arrows, trend lines. On the last page, a projection sat in a neat box. It did not scream. It whispered the same truth. The plant could not coast. By dusk, an online forum posted a grainy photo of the Lorraine Gate. The caption was simple and scared. "Is this the end?" Comments multiplied until the page staggered under the weight. Grace returned home to the smell of bread and rain. She fed Scout and stood at the sink with the faucet running, palms under the cool ribbon of water. It felt like washing a wound she could not see. She wiped the counter and lined up the bills. She set her phone face down and looked at the toolbox instead. People told themselves stories to survive. Ours was always this: work hard, keep faith, show up. Her father had believed it, and the belief had made him generous and stubborn and kind. If the plant closed, what story would take its place? The glow from her laptop cut a long rectangle across the table. She lifted the lid and watched the inbox build itself like scaffolding. New, new, new. Subject lines stamped in black, then gray. She scrolled, heart refusing a normal beat. One message stopped her. It had the company masthead and a timestamp that made her breath thin. Subject meeting request. Body CEO request meeting with Grace Whitman. Time 9:00 a.m. tomorrow. Location executive floor. Office 12. The rain answered on the window, steady as a drum. Scout lifted his head, waiting to see if she would move. Grace did not. She read the lines again, each one a nail set gently, waiting for the hammer. The morning smelled like lemon cleaner and wet wool. Grace stepped off the elevator and onto the executive floor as if the carpet itself were a plank hung over open air. Each footfall felt measured, deliberate, too loud in a hallway that preferred whispers. Overnight rain still clung to her coat. A chill soaked into the fabric. She pressed her badge to a quiet reader. The green light flicked once. No one spoke. She smoothed her blouse, more for courage than neatness, and walked toward Office 12. Glass walls turned the corridor into a mirror. For a second she saw a version of herself she didn't recognize. Pale, tired, slightly older than the number on her driver's license. On the far side of the glass, the city wore a slate sky, buildings shouldering the wind. In her head, she rehearsed lines she might need. "I'm sorry. It was unprofessional. It won't happen again." None of the sentences felt large enough to contain the damage. She imagined a cardboard box under her arm by noon, a plant clipped to fit inside, pens rattling in a coffee mug, Scout waiting by the door that evening, tail thumping, unaware that the rent for next month had just become a question. A receptionist nodded and motioned to a chair. Grace sat and let her hands rest on her knees. Her palms were damp. The clock on the wall ticked with the relentless patience of machines. She felt as if the second hand pressed on her ribs. When the door opened, she stood too quickly and had to steady herself. Daniel Hart stood in the doorway, not smiling, not frowning, just there, as if carved from the light that ran along the glass edge. He gestured her in. His office was cold in its order, a long desk, a single plant that looked like it needed permission to grow. Framed photographs of the old shop on the south side. On the wall, an aerial shot of Lorraine, the plant like a block of slate near the lake. "Sit," he said, but the word wasn't sharp. It was a simple instruction, like place the wrench back on the pegboard. She lowered into the chair. He remained standing for a moment, fingers resting on the back of his own chair, then sat and turned the laptop screen slightly so its glow faced him alone. She didn't need to see it to feel the gravity of what it held. He had read her email, all of it, not a skim, not a glance. She could tell by the way his eyes moved, by the stillness he wore the way other men wore cologne. "The 6-step approvals," he said finally, not as a question. The way a form walks from desk to desk and dies on the staircase. Heat crawled into Grace's neck. She wanted to fold herself into her coat and disappear. She kept her gaze near the edge of his desk, where the grain of the wood ran like water. He continued, naming realities she had only dared to type after midnight. Silos between departments. The fear that landed in a room before he did. Campaigns tuned for slide decks, and not for people who use the tools. He didn't defend or argue. He placed the facts down one by one, like parts on a clean cloth. When he looked up, the line of his mouth was unreadable. You said the quiet part out loud, Ms. Whitman. A pause. And you were specific. She couldn't trust her voice yet, so she nodded once. The heartbeat in her throat softened just enough for air. I could fire you, he said, and the word made the room contract. For the message, for sending it to me, for tone. He let the options hang in the cold office air as if he were checking a parts list. He closed the laptop. The sound was small, final. What she expected next was an instruction to human resources, a neat end to an untidy night. Instead, he slid a legal pad across the desk. A pen followed, light click against paper. You have 7 days, he said. Bring me a plan, not a complaint. A plan. He tapped the pad once. If you can name the problems, you can name the steps. 2 pages, not 20. Approvals, communication between plant and office. A way to hear from the floor without filtering it to death. Grace blinked. Her mind fought to connect the dots. 7 days. A plan. The words reorganized the furniture in her chest. He leaned back, measuring her with a gaze that didn't feel cruel, just exact. What you bring me will carry weight, he said. We have decisions to make. Lorraine among them. The name fell between them like a wrench set down too hard. Lorraine. In her head, she saw the church basement, steam rising from foil pans. The Union Hall with its scuffed chairs. The football field on a Friday night. The way the lights carved the field from the dark. Her father's lunchbox. His hands. The nicked knuckles that healed and split again. I understand, she said, finally trusting her voice. It scraped a little on the way out. He nodded once, as if she had passed or at least accepted the assignment. 7 days, he repeated, not unkind. Close the loop with me, daily. What you need that you can't get, bring up fast. The meeting ended without ceremony. She stood. For a moment, her knees argued with the idea. Her fingertips brushed the legal pad like touching a live wire. She tucked it under her arm, along with the pen. He had given her a tool, or a test, perhaps both. At the door she paused, not to argue, not to plead, simply to steady herself for the hallway. The city's light felt grayer through the glass. Or maybe the glass simply told the truth. In the corridor the air seemed thinner. She walked slowly so her steps wouldn't echo. The receptionist glanced up, curious but professional. Grace wished she could hand the woman something ordinary to hold mail, a file, a smile that didn't look borrowed. Instead, she crossed the carpet and pressed the elevator button. While she waited, she let the morning assemble itself into sense. The email had not cost her the job. Not yet. It had cost her the option of hiding. In its place, she had been given a deadline. The elevator bell chimed. The doors opened on a box of brushed steel and silence. She stepped in and pressed the lobby button, then watched her reflection tremble slightly in the seam where the doors met. Her face held more color than it had when she arrived. Not confidence. Something smaller and braver permission to try. As the elevator sank, she lifted the legal pad. The top sheet was bright as a winter sky. She wrote a date in the corner and then, under it, a single line, measure twice, cut once. Her father's voice, dressed as advice for wood, fit today like it had been forged for it. In the lobby, the smell of citrus and copier ink greeted her. She found a bench and sat for a minute to breathe. 7 days would stretch long and move fast. She would need to choose what mattered and let the rest fall off the table without shame. The approvals that ate time, the missing bridge between shop floor and office, a way to listen that rewarded honesty instead of punishing it. She pictured the Lorraine gate under a gray sky, a young man rubbing his wrists after a long shift, a woman counting overtime against daycare. She pictured her mother at the kitchen table, sorting mail with careful fingers, setting aside a catalog she couldn't afford to read. These weren't numbers, but the numbers lived in them. Grace stood and tucked the pad deeper under her arm. The pen clip bit the cardboard softly, a reminder that the tool was real. As she walked toward the exit, a draft from the revolving door lifted the hem of her coat, cold air pouring in from the street like truth. The elevator doors upstairs would close behind someone else soon enough. But for now, they had closed behind her with the soft finality of a stopwatch starting. The blank page in her hand felt heavier than paper should, a sheet stamped in her mind with the clean word "steal." The deadline sat like a weight on her shoulders. 7 days. 1 week to reshape the fate of a factory and a town. Grace opened the legal pad on her kitchen table, her hand trembling with the pen, but her eyes fixed on a memory of Lorraine. The mill's whistle, her father's hands blackened with oil, the smell of steel clinging to his jacket. She could almost hear him saying, "Measure twice, cut once." Her plan began with 3 pillars, each scribbled in her neat script. First, cut approvals. 6 signatures strangled ideas until they gasped. 2 signatures would keep accountability without killing time. Second, a bridge, not brick and mortar, but a digital platform, shift workers, engineers, office staff, all speaking in one place. She wrote the name in block letters, Bridge. Third, Pride Reborn, from their hands tools etched with the names of the very people who shaped them, not just the company logo. Scout dozed by her feet, tail flicking against the rug. The bakery below filled the night with the scent of sugar cooling, a sweetness that clashed with the bitter coffee on her tongue. She wrote until the numbers blurred, until the pad filled with arrows and underlines. Midweek. She drove north to Lorraine. The sky was low and gray, lake wind biting through her coat. The plant gates looked as tired as she felt. Metal bars painted and repainted until layers peeled back like old bark. Inside, the floor thundered with presses. Sparks leapt in bright arcs. Oil and sweat clung to the air. Beth Gardner, a welder with shoulders strong from decades at the line, greeted her with a skeptical smile. "You Hart's secretary?" she asked, eyes narrowing just enough to sting. Grace nodded, cheeks warming. They walked past machines, Grace clutching her notepad as if it were armor. Beth pointed to a stack of forms on a foreman's desk. "By the time these get signed, the order's late. We work double to catch up, and nobody upstairs sees the cost." Her voice was tired, not bitter, tired like the steel beams overhead. Grace listened, jotting down every detail. She touched the edge of one form, paper soft from handling. She thought of her plan's first pillar, 2 signatures, not 6. Simple, maybe even possible. In the break room, Grace unwrapped a sandwich she had packed at dawn. Beth poured black coffee into a dented mug. "Why'd you come down here?" Beth asked. Grace hesitated, then said, "Because this isn't just numbers, it's names. My father's toolbox is still on my shelf." Beth studied her for a long beat, then gave a short nod. Respect, cautious but real. Back in Columbus that night, Grace spread her father's tools across the table. She lined the punch, the square, the tape measure in a row, and built her plan around them. She typed until midnight, the hum of the bakery's ovens below like a steady heartbeat. Daniel Hart followed her progress from a distance. He didn't hover, but each morning he checked the dashboards, pilot metrics, approval cycle times, a login count on the bridge prototype. The numbers began to move, small but undeniable. For the first time in months, something shifted in his chest respect, though he didn't call it that yet. By the end of the week, the pilot launched. A 2-week trial, the new approval chain, the bridge platform connecting supervisors to shop floor, the first from their hands tool, a hammer stamped with Beth Gardner's initials beside the Hart and Weaver brand. Beth held it up, eyes softening in the fluorescent light. The first night of the trial, Grace stayed late on the Lorraine floor. She sat with her laptop balanced on a crate, tracking feedback as it streamed through Bridge. Workers posted notes in quick bursts, simple, direct, sometimes sharp. For the first time, voices crossed shifts and walls without waiting for forms. Then a siren split the air. A press jammed on the line. The warning lights pulsed red, reflecting in every worried face. Supervisors turned, eyes landing on Grace. She wasn't management, she wasn't a foreman, but she was here, the one who had promised a new way. Her throat tightened. She could almost hear her father again. "Don't flinch. Gracie, steel needs steady hands." She stepped toward the line. "Log it on bridge," she said firmly, pointing to the console. "Mark the cause, the time, the downtime. No hiding it. Let's see the truth." The red lights kept flashing. The machine hissed, but someone typed. The siren cut off. The entry appeared on her screen. Time stamp, initials, note. Grace exhaled. Not victory, not yet, but proof that the system could hold under stress. She lifted her chin, met the worker's eyes, and nodded once. The night resumed. The pilot lived, and the clock on her 7 days ticked louder in her head. When everyone waited for failure, the numbers began to whisper something else. They showed up on dashboards in black and green, quiet lines marching upward where red had lived for months. Approval time dropped nearly 70%. Projects that had limped for weeks now moved in days. Orders left the plant on schedule. The rhythm of the floor steadied like a machine finely tuned. Grace sat at her desk in Columbus with the weekly report spread before her. She traced the columns with her finger, each percentage a small breath of relief. She had expected resistance, maybe even sabotage, but here was proof that the new path wasn't only theory. It carried weight in steel and shipments. In Lorraine, Beth Gardner swung a hammer with her initials etched into the head. She didn't make speeches. She simply brought it to the union hall and set it on the table beside a tray of brownies. Word spread faster than any memo. Photos of the tool appeared online, captioned with pride, "From their hands." Someone wrote, a local blogger picked it up. Soon the story threaded through community pages, the old company honoring the names of its own. The posts reached hardware stores that had dropped Hard & Weaver months before. One buyer called, asking if the new hammers would carry names in every batch. Customers like stories, he admitted, especially real ones. A test order followed, modest but hopeful. On the plant floor, men and women who had long stopped smiling at work began to show small signs. A joke over coffee, a nod of respect when reports moved without vanishing in stacks. Grace noticed the change when she visited one evening. The air still smelled of oil, but something lighter wove through it, relief, maybe even pride. She returned to Columbus with her pad thick with notes. Daniel reviewed the updates with the same cold efficiency he gave all reports, but she caught the briefest flicker near his mouth. Not a full smile, just a crease softened. For him, it was a shout. Not everyone celebrated. Middle managers felt the ground shift under their feet. Where 6 signatures had once guaranteed their importance, now 2 were enough. Authority that once made them gatekeepers thinned into paper. Their voices, once essential in the maze, now sounded smaller. In the break room of the Columbus office, a comment slipped into the air like smoke. Of course she's succeeding. She's got the boss behind her. The words carried, repeated in corners and copied in emails that never reached her directly. Special treatment. Favorite. The tone dripped with the ease of envy. Grace heard fragments, always half hidden. In the hallway, as she passed. In a meeting, when eyes slid away too quickly. The word privilege cut deeper than it seemed to those who said it. She had no privilege. She had only the late nights, the trembling hand over her father's punch, the faith that 7 days could mean more than nothing. She considered defending herself, writing a memo, confronting a whisper with louder words. But in the end, she chose silence. Let the report speak. Let steel tell the story. She held her tongue even as heat rose in her chest. That night, she sat by the toolbox again. Scout snored softly on the rug. She lifted the square, cold and smooth, and pressed it to the page of her notebook. The results were real, yet the air carried a storm's weight. Shadows gathered at the edges of the light, waiting for their chance to grow. The heaviest wound is not an accusation. It is the chair beside you that stays empty while the whole room hums with chatter. Grace felt it first in the cafeteria. The smell of fried chicken and potatoes clung to the air. Trays clattered, and laughter bounced against the high ceiling. Yet, when she sat down, forks stilled for a beat. Conversations shifted. The chair next to her stayed untouched, though 3 people had just passed, trays in hand. She ate slowly, eyes fixed on her plate. Every bite of macaroni seemed thicker than it should have been. Scout's image on her phone background gave her something to look at when the silence pressed too heavy. She told herself she didn't need company. She had work. She had her father's tools. But the sting stayed. Little traps began to appear. A form slipped under her door without a due date, then called late the next day. A meeting moved 10 minutes earlier, yet the notice reached her 5 minutes too late. Each mistake was small enough to deny intention, but large enough to scratch her record. She kept her tone calm, her smile steady. When asked why she'd arrived late, she quipped, "Time must run faster on the top floor." The joke earned nervous chuckles, but the air remained thick. Humor became her shield. Dry, quiet lines tossed into heavy spaces. She didn't shout, didn't protest. She carried on, each joke a thin layer of armor. Inside, though, she heard the echo of boots on steel catwalks, her father's voice saying, "Stand tall, Gracie." Even when they push, Daniel noticed. He saw the reports of her isolation. He caught glimpses himself, the pause when she entered a room, the way conversation died too quickly. Part of him wanted to step beside her in the cafeteria, to place his tray on that empty table. His jaw tightened with the urge, but he knew what it would spark. If he stood there, the whispers of favoritism would roar. So he held back, pacing his office at night, staring out at the lights of Columbus, torn between protection and prudence. At home, Grace's mother called from Lorraine. Her voice was thin, worried. "They say the plant might close. What will happen to the town?" To us, Grace listened, the old clock ticking in the background of the call. She pressed her fingers to her forehead. "I'm working on it." "Mom," she whispered, "but I can't promise yet." She hung up and sat long in the dark, the hum of the refrigerator the only answer. A week later, a letter arrived on her desk, plain envelope, no logo. She opened it with slow fingers. Inside was an invitation written in careful script. Union Hall Gathering, Lorraine First Methodist. CEO Hart requested to explain decisions. Community invited, Saturday, 7 p.m. Her breath caught. This was no boardroom, no polished conference. This was home, the men and women she had grown up among, who had carried casseroles to her mother's porch after her father's funeral. They wanted answers. She could stay in Columbus, safe behind reports and walls of glass. Or she could go back, stand in front of her own neighbors, and risk their anger. Her stomach twisted at the thought. She remembered her father's grease-stained cap resting on the pew of that very church. She knew what he would say. Saturday came. The drive north stretched under gray clouds. Fields rolled past, and the smell of damp earth filled her car. Her hands gripped the wheel tight. As she neared Lorraine, smokestacks rose against the sky, steady and solemn. She parked outside the church, the old stone walls darkened by years of rain. The bell began to toll, low and heavy, calling the town inside. People gathered on the steps, their faces lined with worry and suspicion. Grace stood at the curb, breath sharp in her chest. Her shoes crunched against gravel as she stepped closer. The sounds seemed too loud, echoing in her ears. She reached the bottom of the stone stairs. The bell rang again and again, each note rolling into her bones. She closed her eyes, drew in a breath as deep as the lake winds, and placed her foot on the first step. A single grainy photo can shake stock prices and bend reputations. It happened 2 days after the Union Hall meeting. Grace had stood near the back, listening to voices heavy with fear and frustration. Daniel had answered questions with his usual composure, but his gaze had flicked to her more than once, as though drawing strength from her presence. When the gathering ended, the two of them stepped out together into the night air. He walked a half step behind her, hand raised in a polite gesture as she descended the church steps. To her, it was nothing. To someone with a phone camera, it was everything. By morning, a financial blog splashed the image across its homepage. The headline screamed, "CEO shows unusual favor towards secretary after plant uproar." The picture was blurry, streetlight halos smudging their outlines. Yet the suggestion was sharp. Two figures close in the dark. Too close. The article implied markets moved before explanations could. Hart and Weaver's stock dipped 3% by noon. Analysts speculated whether leadership had blurred the line between personal and professional. Every network repeated the same photograph, each time with new captions. Scandal, favoritism, nepotism. At headquarters, Daniel faced a boardroom lined with gray suits. They spoke in clipped voices, words like fiduciary responsibility and shareholder trust bouncing against the long windows. "Your judgment is under question," one director said flatly. Another warned, "Perception is as damaging as fact." Daniel's jaw clenched, his pen tapping once, twice, against the table. He wanted to snap that their focus should be on numbers, on improved output, on returning orders, on pride returning to Lorraine. But the room cared only for headlines. Meanwhile, HR called Grace into a narrow office. The blinds were drawn tight, air heavy with the scent of stale coffee. A manager she barely knew folded her hands, voice dripping with rehearsed sympathy. "You've become the center of an unfortunate story," she said. "Regardless of truth, the company's image suffers. We believe it best if you consider voluntary resignation. It would be noble." Noble. The word cut like ice. Grace sat still, back straight, hands folded in her lap. She did not argue, she did not cry, she only nodded, rose, and walked out with her steps measured, though her chest felt hollow. That evening, rain lashed Columbus. Her small apartment smelled of wet wool and metal as she pulled her father's toolbox from beneath the desk. She placed the resignation letter beside it, the paper trembling under her pen. Scout lay curled nearby, ears twitching at the thunder. She wrote slowly, each stroke heavy. Resignation, effective immediately. She paused, fingers pressing hard enough to dent the page. Her mind spun with images: the empty cafeteria chair, her mother's worried voice, Beth's hammer engraved with pride, all of it slipping because of a photograph she hadn't even known was taken. When the words were complete, she stared at the letter under the dim lamp. Lightning split the sky, white veins across black. She pressed the mouse, the small click loud in the silence. Sent. Thunder followed, rolling so hard the window rattled in its frame. Scout startled, leaping onto the couch. Grace sat unmoving, hands pressed flat to the desk. The sound filled the room, as though the storm itself bore witness to her surrender. Then her phone vibrated, sharp against the wood. She turned it over with numb fingers. On the glowing screen, a single name appeared. Private number, Daniel Hart. The storm raged louder outside as the phone continued to buzz in her hand. Rain in Ohio fell heavy, a curtain across the night. Grace sat at her desk, the glow of the lamp paling against flashes of lightning. The resignation letter was already gone, carried into a system that cared nothing for tears or silence. Scout stirred, tail twitching, unsettled by the storm. Then came a knock, not timid, not polite, firm, urgent, echoing against the thin wood. She froze, heart thudding. Another knock followed, then the sound of rain dripping as if shaken from cloth. She rose, stepped slow, and opened the door. Daniel stood there, rain streaming from his hair, his coat soaked through. His shoulders rose and fell with the weight of his breath. In the hallway light, his eyes carried no steel, no armor, only raw insistence. Without a word, he stepped inside. Water pooled at his shoes. He pulled the heavy coat from his shoulders and draped it across hers. The fabric smelled of rain and wool, its dampness warming oddly against her skin. Grace trembled. She wanted to speak, to explain, to defend, yet her throat closed. The storm outside roared louder, filling the silence between them. Daniel looked at the resignation letter lying on the desk, then back at her. His jaw tightened, but he didn't scold. He didn't argue. Instead, he said softly, almost hoarse, "No." It wasn't a command. It was a plea. The air thickened with all the words unsaid. Grace felt the ache in her chest swell. She thought of the whispers, the empty chair, the sting of being called privileged. She thought of her father's hands, rough and steady, holding steel that built their lives. And here stood Daniel, not as a CEO, not as a rumor, but as a man stripped bare by rain and fear of losing her. Her eyes burned. She lowered her head, the coat slipping slightly from her shoulders. Daniel reached out, steadying it. His touch was brief, respectful, but it carried weight heavier than any speech. They didn't argue numbers. They didn't list reasons. Trust hung in the silence like a fragile thread finally visible. Grace's breath shook. She whispered, why Daniel didn't rush. He let the storm fill the pause. Then he answered, steady but quiet, because you're the only one who ever told me the truth, and I can't let that walk away. The words pierced through the noise of rain, through every layer of doubt she had carried. She lifted her gaze, meeting his. The ice she had imagined around him was gone. In its place was warmth raw, unsure, but real. They stood that way for a long time. The rain softened, tapping like fingers against the window. Scout curled tighter on the rug, purring now, sensing the shift. Daniel finally exhaled, his shoulders easing. Tomorrow, I'll face them. The press, the board, everyone. His lips curved in a faint, weary smile. But tonight, I just needed you to know. Grace's hand brushed the edge of the coat, her heart still hammered, but a strange calm bloomed beneath it. She nodded, unable to form more. Words weren't needed. They sat together in the small living room, the storm outside fading into a steady drizzle. Silence held them, but it was no longer heavy. It was shelter. When dawn broke, gray and muted, Daniel rose. His clothes had dried stiff, his hair still messy from the rain. He looked toward the window, then back at her. I have a press conference to prepare, he said. His tone was calm now, resolve anchored. Grace followed him to the door. He paused, hand on the knob, then gave her one last glance, not of command, not of coldness, but of promise. And then he stepped into the gray morning, leaving the faint scent of rain and wool behind. The press hall smelled of fresh paint and nerves. Rows of cameras blinked red, their lenses wide and unforgiving. Reporters shuffled, notebooks ready, murmurs swelling and fading like waves against stone. Grace sat at the side row, hands folded so tightly her knuckles blanched. Beside her, Daniel stood at the podium, a gray suit sharp against the flood of white lights. The first flash hit, so bright it stole the breath from her lungs. More followed, strobing across the hall. The sound of shutters became a storm. Grace lowered her eyes to the polished table, her chest tight. This was no Union Hall, no whispered rumor. This was the world watching. Daniel adjusted the microphone, his hand steady. His voice carried deep, calm. Thank you for being here. I will not run from questions, nor from truth. The room hushed. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised. First, let me state clearly, he continued, the growth Hart and Weaver has seen this quarter did not come from favoritism. It came from reform, real reform, cutting waste, streamlining approvals, restoring pride in the hands that shape our steel. A murmur rippled, half doubt, half surprise. Daniel's voice grew firmer. Today, I am announcing 2 permanent initiatives. The first, Reform and Voice, a department open to all employees to propose changes, to speak without fear. Second, Truthline, an anonymous channel where concerns and ideas will be protected, no voice too small, no truth ignored. Shutters clicked faster. Grace lifted her head slightly. The words seemed to steady the floor under her feet. And to lead this reform, Daniel said, pausing just enough for the room to lean in. I am appointing Grace Whitman as director. Gasps broke the silence. A wave of whispers surged. Some pens scratched furiously. Grace's breath caught, heat rushing to her face. Director? Her Daniel pressed on. She is not here because of favoritism. She is here because she spoke when no one else dared. Because her ideas saved Lorraine. At the mention of the plant, the room stilled. He seized it. Lorraine will remain open. Not only open, but central. We will shift our consumer tools to the new from their hands line, each piece carrying the pride of its maker. And let me be clear, we will retrain, not discard, no mass layoffs. Our people are not numbers. They are legacy. Silence thickened, heavy as molten steel cooling. Grace felt her pulse hammer in her ears. Then one clap sounded from the back. Another followed. Soon applause spread, uneven at first, then rolling like thunder. Reporters shouted over it, questions tumbling. Isn't this dangerous? How will shareholders react? Is this a gamble? Daniel didn't flinch. He stepped from the podium, crossed to Grace. The cameras followed every movement, the flashes a blizzard of light. He reached down, took her hand, and lifted it high. This, he said, his voice cutting through the storm, is not favoritism. This is trust. For a breath. The room froze in stunned quiet. Then applause erupted again, louder, joined by shouts and the crackle of flashes. Grace stood beside him, her hand trembling in his grip, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. Yet beyond the cheers, she caught at the faces that did not join. A director with lips pressed tight, a shareholder whispering into a phone, eyes dark, calculating. Seeds of opposition planted even as the crowd roared. The press conference ended in chaos of voices, questions hurled as Daniel guided her off the stage. Her ears rang, her body light, as if she had floated instead of walked. Back in her office, her inbox flooded. Subject lines shouted, "Congratulations, proud of you, incredible." She scrolled, dazed, her smile trembling with relief. Then, buried among them, one line blinked cold. It's not over. No sender, no signature, only a warning. Grace stared at it, the clatter of applause still echoing in her chest, now shadowed by a chill. Culture never turns because of slogans. It turns because of small habits repeated each morning. 3 months passed, and the slow rhythm of those habits reshaped Hart and Weaver. The Truthline box, once dismissed as symbolic, filled with anonymous notes. Some were simple requests, better gloves in winter, clearer instructions for new hires. Others struck deeper ideas for streamlining safety checks, suggestions for retooling machines to waste less steel. Grace read each submission late into the night, her desk lamp glowing in the Reform and Voice office. From those notes came changes. One team suggested shifting scrap bins closer to welding stations. The adjustment saved both time and thousands of pounds of wasted metal. Another pointed out that the night shift lacked proper lighting near one loading dock. New lamps went up, and within weeks, accidents dropped sharply. The company tallied the results. By spring, operating costs had fallen, not by chance, but by dozens of small, thoughtful corrections. Each one traced back to voices that once would have gone unheard. The from their hands line expanded. At first, it was hammers and wrenches etched with workers' names. Soon, chisels, pliers, and measuring tapes joined, each marked by a story. A shelf in a Cleveland hardware store displayed a set stamped, made by Beth Gardner. Customers bought them quickly, charmed by the real connection. Retailers took notice. One chain that had ended its contract 2 years earlier signed again, eager to stock the story-driven line. Grace visited Lorraine and saw something she hadn't witnessed in years. Men leaving shifts with their heads higher, women pausing outside the gate to talk instead of hurrying to cars. Even the break room felt lighter, laughter breaking through where silence had ruled. Daniel, too, changed. He still carried the weight of a CEO, but he was seen more often on the floor, walking the catwalks, boots damp with machine oil. He joined crews for quick coffees, not in polished boardrooms, but in the small corner diner down the block. One morning, he surprised everyone by ordering black coffee from a vending machine, leaning against the wall as if he belonged there. Workers nudged each other, whispering, "Never thought I'd see Hart drink that." Respect grew, not because of announcements, but because of presence. He listened, he asked questions, and when he didn't know the answer, he admitted it, letting others fill the space. That honesty, rare and disarming, spread through the plant faster than any memo. Grace noticed the shift most clearly in how colleagues looked at her. The cafeteria still buzzed with talk, but the seat beside her no longer stayed empty. Engineers asked her opinion without hesitation. Managers, once skeptical, began to present new data proudly, eager to show results that aligned with reform and voice. Respect no longer hung on rumor. It rested on outcomes. Then came the report. Numbers laid out in black and white. Lorraine had not only broken even ahead of schedule, it had surpassed its quarterly target. The plant once marked for closure now carried a surplus. Grace read the report twice, her hands trembling. Relief spilled through her like sunlight breaking cloud. The ghost of her father's voice seemed to echo, steel ringing on steel, reminding her that hard work could still forge hope. That afternoon, she stood alone in the Reform and Voice office. The walls smelled faintly of fresh paint. On the door hung a new brass plate. Reform and Voice Department. Director Grace Whitman. She traced the letters with her finger. For the first time since the wrong email had flown from her desk, she let out a long, steady breath. It felt like setting down a boulder she had carried too far. Some mistakes we long to repeat because they open the door to an entirely different life. It was late when Grace saw the email. Her inbox was quiet, most messages filed away for Monday. But one subject line glowed against the dark screen. One more mistake. Her breath caught. She clicked it open. Inside was only one line. This time, make the mistake of saying yes. Attached was no document, no chart, just a location. Scioto River Community Garden. Tonight. Grace pressed her fingers to her lips. Her heart thudded with a rhythm that drowned out the hum of her desk lamp. Scout, sensing her tension, pawed at her leg before darting in circles near the door. She drove through the quiet streets of Columbus, windows down to let in the cool night air. The garden sat near the riverbank, where the city lights softened and the air smelled faintly of damp soil and blossoms. Strings of warm bulbs stretched between wooden posts, glowing like stars caught in wire. Daniel stood near the center, under an arch of climbing roses. He wore no suit tonight, only a white shirt, sleeves rolled, collar open, in his hand, a small velvet box. Grace slowed, the gravel crunching under her shoes as she stepped closer. Scout wriggled free of her arms, bounding into the garden, tail wagging like a banner. For a moment, they said nothing. The night was filled instead with the sound of river water slipping past and the soft buzz of bulbs overhead. Daniel's eyes held hers, steady and unguarded. Finally, he spoke. His voice was lower than she had ever heard. Roughened by nerves he couldn't hide. The first email you sent me by mistake changed everything. It forced me to see the truth about the company, about myself. He opened the box. Inside lay a ring, simple, no diamonds, only a band of white gold polished smooth. So tonight, he continued, I'm asking you to make one more mistake. Say yes to me, not just to lead Reform and Voice, not just to stand beside me at the plant. Say yes to the life we could build, together. Grace's chest tightened. Memories surged her father's hammer, the loneliness of empty cafeteria chairs, The storm, when she thought she had lost everything, all of it had led here, to this quiet garden, this man holding a ring not as power, but as promise. Her eyes stung. She whispered, "Yes." The word hung in the air, soft but unshakable. Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling slightly. Then he pulled her close, and for the first time, the distance between CEO and secretary vanished completely. They were just two people, bound by trust, forged in fire and mistakes. Scout barked once, as if in approval, then darted off to chase shadows among the tomato rows. The bulbs swayed in the river breeze, casting light over them. Grace leaned into Daniel's chest, hearing the steady beat beneath his shirt. She realized it matched her own. A rhythm shared. Later that week, an internal email shot through every inbox at Hart and Weaver. It ended with one unexpected line, P.S. The CEO just proposed to the Director of Reform and Voice. She said yes. So everyone, work hard, the wedding cake is on the way. The hallways erupted with laughter. Applause echoed in break rooms. Even the plant floor rang with cheers. For once, whispers carried joy, not suspicion. Grace read the note at her desk, hand resting lightly on the ring. She laughed, cheeks flushed. Around her, voices rose in celebration. For the first time, she felt the weight of her story lift. What began as a mistake had become a vow. When a factory lights up at dawn, an entire town exhales in the same quiet rhythm. 1 year had passed since Grace's wrong email changed everything. Lorraine, once shadowed by the threat of closure, now glowed each evening as furnaces roared and sparks scattered against the night sky. For the people, it was not just the sound of steel. It was the sound of security, of children's futures, of mortgages paid and small dreams kept alive. Inside the plant's front hall, a new installation greeted visitors. Along the wall hung rows of tools, hammers, wrenches, chisels, each etched with the names of those who had made them. Beneath every tool was a small plaque with a short story. A mother working double shifts to put her son through college. A father teaching his daughter to use a wrench. A young welder saving for his first home. Grace often paused here, fingertips grazing the cool metal, remembering her own father's calloused hands. To honor him, she had worked with Daniel to establish the Thomas Whitman Scholarship for Skilled Trades. Each year, 2 students from Lorraine High would receive support to pursue technical training, ensuring the craft her father had loved would not fade with his generation. At the ceremony, mothers wept, fathers clapped their sons on the back, and Grace stood quietly, holding her mother's hand. The wedding came on a mild spring day, not in a ballroom in Columbus, not in some distant resort, but in the small Methodist church in Lorraine, the same place where neighbors had once demanded answers. The pews overflowed with townspeople, co-workers, even skeptical managers who had, over time, turned into supporters. The air smelled of lilacs from gardens carried in jars and baskets. Grace walked the aisle in a simple ivory dress, her mother at her side. Daniel waited, not the cold figure of a CEO, but a man whose smile had softened with time and trust. When the vows were spoken, there were no cameras, no flashing lights, only the sound of voices joined in a hymn, old wood creaking under the weight of community. Afterward, the reception spilled into the churchyard. Long tables stretched under strings of bulbs. Children chased Scout across the grass, while elders shared stories over plates of barbecue and pie. Someone strummed a guitar. Laughter rose, mixing with the smell of grilled corn and summer air. Grace leaned against Daniel's shoulder, watching it all, feeling the town breathe easier around them. Life settled into a rhythm. Mornings began with black coffee from the corner shop, days filled with meetings, factory visits, walks through the Reform and Voice office where walls now brimmed with ideas. Evenings often ended quietly on the small porch of their home, watching the sun set behind the trees. They had traded storms for steadiness, and both found it sweeter. Reports confirmed the turnaround. Lorraine not only survived, but thrived. Accident rates remained low. Sales of from their hands tools grew each quarter. Other towns asked how they had done it, hoping to learn, to keep their own lights burning. Yet what lingered most was not the headlines or the numbers. It was the calm earned after struggle, the knowledge that one wrong click, one burst of honesty, could become the seed of change. Grace often thought of it as she set her ring aside at night, Scout curled at her feet. Mistakes, she realized, are not always the end. Sometimes they are the beginning. As this story closes, it leaves behind a question. One not for Grace, nor Daniel, nor the people of Lorraine, but for you. When was the last time you spoke the truth, even when it frightened you? And what might change if you did? Sometimes the greatest turning points in life come disguised as mistakes. Grace's story reminds us that one wrong click, one unintended moment of honesty, can open a door we never knew existed. For her, it was an email written in exhaustion and frustration. For us, it could be a word spoken too soon, a truth revealed before we felt ready. What matters is not the stumble itself, but what we choose to do afterward. Grace chose to stand by her words. She turned fear into courage, and through that, she helped save jobs, heal a community, and even discover love she had never expected. For those of us further along life's road, this story is a gentle reminder. It is never too late to speak honestly, never too late to stand up for what matters. Mistakes may shake our world for a moment, but honesty and persistence can steady it again. So, when you look back on your own wrong clicks in life, don't only see regret, look for the doors they opened, the lessons they gave, and the people they brought closer. Sometimes the missteps we fear most are the very steps that lead us home. Thank you, dear friends, for spending your time with us and walking through this story. If it touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own journey, we'd be so grateful if you could give this video a like, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that shine a little light into everyday life. Your support helps us keep telling these tales and keeps this community growing.